They said I couldn't remember names anymore, that my mind was slipping like sand through fingers, but I remembered exactly which names to remove from my will. Sometimes the sharpest memories are the ones that cut deepest, and mine were razor sharp when it came to family who thought I'd forgotten how to think for myself. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Dorothy Mae Peterson, and at 73, I've lived in the same weathered farmhouse outside Brookings, South Dakota, for 52 years. The house sits on 40 acres of prairie that my late husband Earl and I bought with our wedding money and a prayer back in 1971. The wind here never stops talking, whispering through the wheat fields that stretch to the horizon, carrying stories and secrets across the endless sky. I've always been good with names, faces, dates, the kind of details that matter when you're keeping track of 4 children, 12 grandchildren, and a lifetime of neighbors who've become family. That's why it stung so deep when my own blood started treating me like I was losing my grip on reality. It started small, the way poison always does. A raised eyebrow when I'd pause mid-sentence, searching for the right word. A gentle correction when I'd mix up which grandchild was in college versus high school. Little comments that felt like paper cuts at first, barely noticeable until they accumulated into something that bled. My youngest son, Michael, was the worst about it. He'd moved back from Minneapolis 3 years ago with his wife Jennifer and their twin boys, claiming he wanted to help me manage the farm and my affairs. What he really wanted was to manage me. Michael had always been the ambitious one, the child who left home at 18 with his sights set on corporate success and city sophistication. When he returned, he brought that same energy to what he saw as the project of Dorothy Peterson. The morning that changed everything started like any other Thursday in late September. The air carried that crisp promise of winter, and I was sitting at my kitchen table with a cup of coffee and the Brookings register spread before me. I always read the obituaries first. Not out of morbidity, but because at my age, you want to know who's still here and who's moved on to whatever comes next. I was scanning the names when I noticed something that made my blood run cold. Harold Gustafson had died. Harold, who'd been Earl's best friend since childhood. Harold, who'd stood as best man at our wedding and helped build the addition on our house when the twins were born. Harold, who'd been fighting cancer for the past year while I'd been bringing him my famous rhubarb crisp every other week. I set down my coffee cup with shaking hands and reached for the phone to call his wife Marge, my heart already heavy with the weight of sympathy I needed to offer. But when I dialed Marge's number, a recording told me it had been disconnected. Confused, I called the funeral home listed in the obituary. The woman who answered had a kind but tired voice, the sort that comes from spending your days helping people navigate their worst moments. "I'm calling about Harold Gustafson," I said. "I'm a close friend of the family, and I wanted to know about services." There was a pause on the other end. "Ma'am, I'm sorry, but there must be some confusion. We don't have anyone by that name, and we haven't had any services scheduled under that name." I read her the obituary word for word. Another pause, longer this time. "Ma'am, that obituary is from 1987. Harold Gustafson died over 30 years ago." The phone slipped from my hand and clattered onto the kitchen table. I stared at the newspaper, at the date printed clearly in the corner, September 28, 2023. But the obituary I'd been reading, the one that had felt so immediate and real, was from decades past. I picked up the paper again, studying it more carefully. Sure enough, scattered throughout were obituaries from different years, different decades even, mixed in with current death notices, as if time had folded in on itself. That's when I noticed the note tucked under my coffee cup, written in Michael's neat handwriting. "Mom, I've been leaving these old papers mixed in with new ones to see if you'd notice." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. "We need to talk. I'm coming by this afternoon." The betrayal hit me like a physical blow. My own son had been testing me, setting traps in my daily routine like I was a lab rat in some cruel experiment. I sat there for a long time, feeling the familiar weight of the house around me, listening to the grandfather clock in the hallway tick away moments that suddenly felt more precious than they had an hour before. When Michael arrived that afternoon, he brought Jennifer and a man I didn't recognize, someone in a press suit who carried a leather briefcase like a shield. They arranged themselves around my kitchen table with the casual confidence of people who'd already decided my fate. Michael's face wore that expression I'd seen too many times lately, a mixture of patience and pity that made me feel like a child being gently scolded. "Mom, we need to discuss some concerns," Michael began, his voice taking on that slow, careful tone people use when they think you might not understand simple concepts. "Jennifer and I have been noticing some changes. The incident with Harold's obituary this morning, the time last week when you called me David, the way you've been repeating yourself more often." David was my eldest son, Michael's brother, who died in a car accident 15 years ago. I had called Michael by his brother's name exactly once, during a moment when grief had ambushed me while we stood in David's old bedroom, which I'd been cleaning out for the first time since the funeral. But Michael had latched on to that single slip like evidence in a trial. "Who's your friend?" I asked, nodding toward the man in the suit. "This is Robert Chen," Michael said. "He's an elder law attorney. We asked him to come today to discuss some options for protecting your assets and ensuring your care." The word protecting hung in the air like smoke. Protecting from what? From whom? The only threat I could see was sitting at my own kitchen table, wearing my son's face. Robert Chen opened his briefcase and pulled out a stack of papers. His smile was professional, practiced, the kind that probably worked well on families in crisis but felt condescending in my sunny kitchen. "Mrs. Peterson, your son and daughter-in-law are concerned about your ability to manage your financial affairs. There are some legal instruments we can put in place to ensure your security." I scanned the documents he spread across the table. Power of attorney forms. Guardianship papers. Documents that would effectively sign away my right to make decisions about my own life, my own property, my own future. At the bottom of each page was a line for my signature, already marked with yellow sticky notes. "You want me to sign away my independence because I mixed up some old newspapers?" I asked. "It's not just the newspapers, Mom," Jennifer said, speaking for the first time. Her voice was softer than Michael's, but somehow more cutting. "Last month you forgot our anniversary dinner. You've been getting confused about appointments. Yesterday you asked me 3 times if I'd seen your reading glasses while they were on your head." I looked at her. This woman who'd married my son 12 years ago and had spent most of that time finding subtle ways to let me know I wasn't sophisticated enough for her tastes. Jennifer had always been polite but distant, the kind of person who smiled while she cataloged her shortcomings. "I've been forgetting small things," I admitted. "But I'm 73 years old. I've earned the right to be a little forgetful about dinner parties and glasses. That doesn't mean I can't manage my own affairs." Michael leaned forward, his expression growing more serious. "Mom, it's not just small things. You've been telling the same stories over and over. You ask us the same questions multiple times in a single conversation. And the incident with Harold Gustafson shows that you're having trouble distinguishing between past and present. The incident with Harold Gustafson shows that my son has been deliberately trying to confuse me," I shot back. "You planted those old obituaries to make me look foolish. What kind of person does that to their own mother?" Robert Chen cleared his throat, clearly uncomfortable with the family tension. "Mrs. Peterson, these documents are really for your protection. They would allow your son to help manage your finances, ensure your bills are paid, make medical decisions if you become unable to do so yourself." "I pay my bills just fine," I said. "I balance my checkbook every month. I know exactly how much money I have and where it is. I make my own medical appointments and show up on time. The only thing I'm unable to do is trust my son not to play psychological games with me." The 3 of them exchanged glances, the kind of look that passes between conspirators. I realized in that moment that they'd already decided I was incompetent. This wasn't a discussion, it was a presentation. They'd come here with their papers and their plans, expecting me to docilely sign away my autonomy because they'd convinced themselves it was for my own good. "What if I refuse?" I asked. Another exchange of glances. "Well," Robert Chen said carefully, "if there are significant concerns about cognitive capacity, there are legal processes that can be initiated to protect an individual's interests." The threat was delivered in lawyer speak, wrapped in euphemisms and professional courtesy, but it was unmistakably a threat. "Sign these papers willingly, or we'll find a way to force you." I stood up from the table, my chair scraping against the kitchen floor with a sound like fingernails on chalkboard. I think you should all leave now. Mom, please, Michael said. We're trying to help you. No, I said, my voice steady despite the fury building in my chest. You're trying to help yourselves. You're trying to convince me I'm losing my mind so you can take control of my life and my property. But I see exactly what's happening here, and my memory is just fine. They left, but not before Robert Chen placed his business card on the kitchen table with the suggestion that I think about what they'd discussed. After their car disappeared down the gravel driveway, I sat alone in my kitchen, surrounded by the familiar comfort of 40 years' worth of memories soaked into the walls. The grandfather clock continued its steady ticking, marking time that suddenly felt both infinite and desperately short. That evening, I did something I hadn't done in months. I called my neighbor Evelyn Larson, who lived on the adjacent farm with her husband Tom. Evelyn was my age, sharp as a tack, and had been my closest friend since the day we'd moved to South Dakota. If anyone would give me an honest assessment of my mental state, it would be Evelyn. Evie, I said when she answered, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me. Have you noticed me being more forgetful lately? More confused? There was a pause on the other end of the line. Well, Dorothy, you did ask me twice last week if I'd seen that new movie with the talking animals, but honestly, I do that kind of thing all the time. Why are you asking? I told her about Michael's visit, about the documents and the threats and the obituary test. By the time I finished, Evelyn was sputtering with indignation. That boy ought to be ashamed of himself, she said. Testing you like some kind of science experiment. You're one of the sharpest people I know, Dorothy. Sure, we all forget things now and then, but your mind is as clear as it ever was. Clearer than some people half your age. After I hung up, I felt some of my confidence returning. But I also felt something else. A cold, calculating anger that surprised me with its intensity. If Michael wanted to play games about memory and competence, I could play games too. And I'd been playing them a lot longer than he had. The next morning, I drove into town to visit my longtime attorney, Frank Jorgensen. Frank had handled Earl's will when he died, had helped me with property disputes over the years, and had been a friend of our family for decades. His office was in one of Brookings' original buildings, all dark wood and leather-bound books, the kind of place where serious business got done without fanfare. Frank listened to my story with the careful attention of someone who'd seen every variety of family drama over 4 decades of practice. When I finished, he leaned back in his chair and steepled his fingers. Dorothy, I've known you for 25 years, he said. You're as mentally competent as anyone who walks through that door. But I'm concerned about what Michael might try to do. These guardianship proceedings can be initiated by family members, and once they start, they can be difficult to stop. What are my options? I asked. Frank pulled out a legal pad and began making notes. Several things. First, we can document your competency with a formal evaluation if necessary. Second, we can make sure all your legal documents are current and properly executed. Third, we can take some proactive steps to protect your interests. What kind of proactive steps? Well, Frank said, glancing up from his notes, you could revise your will. Make it clear that you're of sound mind and that your decisions are deliberate and informed. And you could include specific language about attempts to have you declared incompetent. I thought about this for a moment. My current will left the farm and most of my assets to my 4 children equally, with smaller bequests to my grandchildren and a few local charities. It was a straightforward document, reflecting my desire to treat all my children fairly despite their different circumstances and personalities. Frank, if I wanted to change my will, how would I go about it? We'd draft a new one. You'd need to be very clear about your reasoning for any changes, especially if you're excluding someone who might expect to inherit. The document would need to demonstrate your competency and your deliberate intent. I spent the rest of that afternoon thinking about my children and what they'd brought to my life over the years. My eldest, David, had been killed by a drunk driver while driving home from his daughter's piano recital. Sarah, my second child, lived in Oregon with her husband and called every Sunday, never missing a birthday or holiday. Lisa, my third, was a nurse in Sioux Falls who visited monthly and helped me with medical appointments without trying to take over my life. And then there was Michael. Michael, who'd returned home claiming he wanted to help but seemed more interested in managing me than supporting me. Michael, who'd played psychological games to make me doubt my own mind. Michael, who'd brought lawyers to my kitchen table and threatened legal action if I didn't cooperate with his plans. That night, I sat at my kitchen table with a yellow legal pad and began making lists. Not grocery lists or to-do lists, but careful inventories of my relationships with each of my children. I wrote down specific memories, recent conversations, patterns of behavior that had emerged over the past few years. I documented every instance I could remember of Michael questioning my competency, every subtle comment from Jennifer about my declining abilities. But I also wrote down other things. The way Sarah always asked about my garden and remembered which vegetables I was trying to grow each year. How Lisa had helped me research Medicare options without ever suggesting I couldn't understand them myself. The way my grandchildren still sought me out for advice and comfort, treating me like a source of wisdom rather than a burden to be managed. The exercise clarified something I'd been feeling but hadn't been able to articulate. Michael's behavior wasn't really about protecting me or helping me. It was about control. Maybe it was financial, maybe it was psychological, but it was definitely about his need to be in charge of my life and my decisions. Over the next few weeks, I began to pay closer attention to our interactions. I started keeping a small notebook where I'd record conversations, noting when Michael would interrupt me, correct me, or speak about me as if I weren't in the room. I documented the way Jennifer would exchange meaningful glances with him when I'd pause to think about something or ask for clarification about their plans. What I discovered was a pattern of behavior designed to undermine my confidence and make me question my own perceptions. They'd ask me the same question multiple times, then act concerned when I'd answer it again. They'd change plans without telling me, then express worry when I'd show up at the wrong time or place. They'd bring up topics from years past, then act alarmed when I'd need a moment to place the reference in context. It was gaslighting, plain and simple. They were systematically trying to make me doubt my own mind so they could justify taking control of my life. And the more I recognized the pattern, the angrier I became. 3 weeks after their first visit, Michael called to say he was coming by again, this time with some additional paperwork for me to review. I told him I'd be happy to meet with him, and I spent the morning preparing for what I knew would be another attempt to pressure me into signing away my independence. When he arrived, he brought Jennifer again. But this time, he also brought his twin sons, Jake and Josh, who were 16 years old. The boys looked uncomfortable, clearly unsure why they'd been included in what was obviously a serious family discussion. I brought the boys because I want them to understand what's happening with Grandma Dorothy, Michael explained as they settled around the kitchen table. I think it's important for them to see how families take care of each other. The manipulation was breathtaking. He was using my own grandchildren as witnesses to my supposed incompetence, trying to create a family narrative where his actions looked caring rather than controlling. I looked at Jake and Josh, these beautiful young men who'd spent countless hours in this kitchen over the years, learning to make cookies and listening to stories about their grandfather Earl. "Boys," I said, "before your father starts talking about taking care of me, I want to ask you something. Do I seem confused to you? When we talk, do you feel like I don't understand what's going on?" Jake, the more outspoken of the twins, shook his head immediately. "No, Grandma, you seem totally normal to me. You remember everything about school and sports and all our friends' names." "Mom, that's not really a fair question," Michael interrupted. "The boys aren't qualified to assess cognitive capacity." "But they're qualified to witness it," I said. "You brought them here to watch you convince me I'm losing my mind. I think they deserve to see all sides of this conversation." I pulled out the notebook I'd been keeping, the one where I'd documented our interactions over the past few weeks. I opened it to a page marked with a yellow sticky note. "Michael, on October 3rd, you called to ask if I'd remembered to pay my property taxes. When I told you yes, you asked me 3 more times in the same conversation. On October 8th, you told me you'd be coming for Sunday dinner, then called Sunday morning to ask why I wasn't expecting you. On October 12th, you brought up the time I forgot Jennifer's birthday party, which happened 6 years ago." Michael's face was growing red. "Mom, I don't know what you're trying to prove with that notebook. I'm proving that I remember things perfectly well, I said. Including the things you'd rather I forgot. Like the way you've been systematically trying to make me doubt my own mind so you can justify taking control of my life. Jennifer leaned forward, her voice taking on that patient tone I'd grown to hate. Dorothy, we're not trying to control your life. We're trying to help you maintain your independence for as long as possible. By taking away my legal right to make my own decisions? By putting safeguards in place before you need them, she said. I looked at my grandsons, who were watching this exchange with wide eyes. They were old enough to understand what was happening, smart enough to see through the euphemisms and careful language. Boys, your parents want me to sign papers that would let them make decisions about my money, my house, my medical care, and pretty much every other aspect of my life. They say it's to protect me, but I want you to think about something. If someone tried to take away your right to make decisions about your own life, how would you feel about it? Josh, usually the quieter twin, spoke up. I'd feel like they didn't trust me to take care of myself. Exactly, I said. And how would you feel if they tested you to see if you were paying attention, then used your mistakes as evidence that you couldn't be trusted? That would be really unfair, Jake said, shooting a look at his father. Michael stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. That's enough. Mom, you're manipulating the boys, and you're twisting everything we've said. We're trying to help you, but you're so paranoid and stubborn that you can't see it. I'm stubborn? I asked. I'm the one who's been living independently for 73 years, managing my own affairs, taking care of my own property. You're the one who moved back here 3 years ago and immediately started finding problems with the way I live my life. Because there are problems, Michael exploded. You're getting older, you're starting to forget things, and you're too proud to admit you need help. The kitchen fell silent, except for the ticking of the grandfather clock. I looked around the table at these people, who shared my blood, my history, my name. Jennifer looked uncomfortable, probably realizing that this confrontation wasn't going according to plan. The boys looked confused and upset, clearly unprepared for the level of conflict they were witnessing. And Michael looked angry, frustrated that his careful campaign to undermine my confidence wasn't working as smoothly as he'd expected. You know what, Michael? I said, my voice quiet but steady. You're right about one thing. I am getting older. But being older doesn't mean being incompetent. And needing help occasionally doesn't mean needing to be managed. The only person who seems confused about that is you. I stood up and walked to the kitchen counter, where I'd left some papers earlier that morning. I picked them up and returned to the table. Since you're so concerned about my memory and my decision-making abilities, I want to show you something, I said. I placed the papers on the table where everyone could see them. This is a letter from Dr. Morrison, my physician for the past 15 years. It's dated yesterday. Would you like me to read it out loud? Michael's face had gone pale. What does it say? It says that I requested a cognitive assessment to address family concerns about my mental capacity. It says that I scored within normal ranges for someone my age on all measures of memory, reasoning, and judgment. It says that while I show some of the minor cognitive changes expected in healthy aging, I show no signs of dementia, significant cognitive impairment, or inability to manage my own affairs. I looked around the table, watching the impact of this information sink in. I had myself tested, Michael, by a real doctor, not by a son with a hidden agenda. And I passed with flying colors. Jennifer was staring at the papers as if they might spontaneously change their content. Why didn't you tell us you were doing this? Because you'd already decided I was incompetent, I said. You weren't looking for evidence of my capacity. You were looking for evidence of my incapacity. I needed an objective assessment from someone who wasn't trying to prove a point. I pulled out another document. And this is a letter from Frank Jorgensen, my attorney. It confirms that I'm legally competent to make my own decisions, and that any attempts to have me declared otherwise would be challenged. Michael slumped back in his chair, looking defeated. Mom, we weren't trying to hurt you, we were trying to protect you. From what? I asked. From living my own life? From making my own mistakes? From having the dignity of independence for as long as I'm able to maintain it? The boys were looking back and forth between their father and me, clearly trying to process what they'd witnessed. I realized that this conversation had probably shattered some of their assumptions about family dynamics and adult relationships. "Jake, Josh," I said, "I want you to remember something about this day. When you're older, when you have children and grandchildren of your own, remember that love doesn't mean control. Taking care of someone doesn't mean taking away their choices. Real love means supporting someone's autonomy even when you're worried about them." After they left, I sat alone in my kitchen, feeling both victorious and drained. I'd successfully defended my independence, but the cost had been high. The relationship with Michael was probably damaged beyond repair, and I wasn't sure how that would affect my relationships with the boys, or even with my other children. But as the afternoon light slanted through my kitchen windows, I felt something I hadn't felt in months. Peace. I'd stood up for myself. I'd refused to be diminished or controlled. I'd proven that my mind was as sharp as it had ever been, and I'd done it on my own terms. That evening, I called Frank Jorgensen at home. "Frank, I want to revise my will." Frank arrived at my house the following Tuesday with a briefcase full of legal documents and a grim expression that told me he'd been thinking seriously about our conversation. We sat at my dining room table, the good table with the lace tablecloth that Earl's mother had crocheted for our wedding, and spread out papers like we were planning a military campaign. "Dorothy, before we begin, I need to make sure you understand what you're considering," Frank said, adjusting his reading glasses. "Changing a will isn't just about moving money around. It sends a message about relationships, about trust, about how you view your family's future. Once Michael discovers he's been removed as a beneficiary, there's no going back from that conversation." I poured us both coffee from the pot I'd made earlier, the good china cups clinking softly against their saucers. Outside, the October wind was stripping the last leaves from the old oak tree Earl had planted the year Lisa was born. The tree had weathered 40 years of South Dakota storms, and it was still standing strong. I figured if it could survive that long, maybe I could survive a family storm or two. "Frank, I've been thinking about this for weeks now," I said. "Michael isn't trying to protect me. He's trying to position himself to take control of everything I've worked for. If I don't take action now, while I'm still legally competent and can make my own decisions, I might not get another chance." Frank nodded slowly, making notes on his yellow pad. "Tell me exactly what you want to do." I had thought about this carefully, lying awake for several nights weighing the consequences of each decision. I want Michael completely removed from the will. No inheritance, no mention, nothing. His children can still inherit their grandfather's tools and some personal items, but I don't want Michael to have any legal claim to this property or my assets. "What about your other children?" Sarah and Lisa split Michael's portion between them. "They've never questioned my competence or tried to manipulate me. They deserve to benefit from their loyalty and respect." I paused, stirring my coffee slowly. "And I want to add some specific language about the circumstances surrounding this change." Frank looked up from his notes. "What kind of language?" "I want it clearly stated that this decision was made while I was of sound mind and body, following a professional cognitive assessment that confirmed my mental capacity. I want it documented that Michael's removal from the will is a direct result of his attempts to have me declared incompetent for his own financial gain." The words felt harsh coming out of my mouth, but they were true. Frank wrote everything down without comment, his pen scratching across the paper with the steady rhythm of someone who drafted hundreds of family dissolution documents over the years. "Dorothy, I have to ask this," Frank said eventually. "Is there any possibility of reconciliation with Michael? Sometimes these family conflicts can be resolved through communication, maybe with a mediator present." I thought about this question seriously because Frank deserved a thoughtful answer. I've been asking myself the same thing. But Frank, this isn't just about a disagreement or a misunderstanding. Michael has been systematically trying to convince me that I'm losing my mind so he can gain control of my life and my property. He's manipulated situations to make me look confused. He's brought lawyers to my kitchen table to pressure me into signing away my rights. That's not the behavior of someone who loves and respects me. That's the behavior of someone who sees me as an obstacle to getting what he wants. Frank set down his pen and leaned back in his chair. In 40 years of practice, I've seen a lot of family dynamics around inheritance and aging. What you're describing is unfortunately not uncommon. Adult children sometimes convince themselves they're acting in their parents' best interest when they're really acting in their own. Exactly. And the problem is that once someone starts down that path, once they've decided you're incompetent, every normal sign of aging becomes evidence to support their theory. If I forget where I put my keys, it's not because I'm human and distracted, it's because I have dementia. If I take a moment to remember someone's name, it's not because I'm 73 years old. It's because my mind is failing. We spent the next 2 hours going through the details of the revised will. Frank explained each section, each clause, each potential legal challenge that Michael might raise. He walked me through the probate process, the timeline for executing the will, and the various ways that disgruntled family members sometimes tried to contest inheritance decisions. The good news is that you've documented everything very thoroughly, Frank said as we reviewed the final draft. Your medical evaluation, your attorney consultation, your detailed reasoning for the changes. If Michael tries to challenge this will on the grounds of diminished capacity, we have substantial evidence to the contrary. What about the grandchildren, Jake and Josh? I don't want them to suffer because of their father's behavior. Frank had anticipated this concern. We can set up a separate trust for them, funded independently of the main inheritance. They'll receive money for college, vocational training, maybe help with buying their first homes. But the funds will be managed by a neutral trustee, not by Michael. The idea of providing for my grandsons while bypassing their father felt complicated but necessary. I loved those boys deeply, but I couldn't risk giving Michael access to resources he might use to continue his campaign against my independence. As Frank packed up his papers, he paused and looked at me seriously. Dorothy, I want you to prepare yourself for Michael's reaction when he eventually learns about these changes. He's not going to accept this quietly, especially if he's been counting on inheriting your property. What kind of reaction are you expecting? He might try to have you declared incompetent. He might claim you were unduly influenced or coerced into making these changes. He might even try to suggest that I took advantage of you professionally. Frank's expression was grim. People do desperate things when they feel like they're losing control of a situation they thought they had handled. I walked Frank to his car, the afternoon air crisp with the promise of winter. The fields around my house stretched endlessly toward the horizon, golden with harvested corn stubble and the last of the prairie grass. This land had been my home for over 5 decades, the place where I'd raised my children and buried my husband, where I'd learned to be strong and self-reliant. The idea that someone might try to take it away from me, might try to convince a court that I was too addled to make my own decisions about my own property, filled me with a rage that surprised me with its intensity. That evening, I called Sarah in Oregon. She answered on the second ring, her voice warm with the pleasure of hearing from me. Mom, how are you? I was just thinking about you today. Tom's been working in the garden, and I was remembering how you taught me to plant bulbs in the fall. I'm fine, sweetheart. Actually, I'm better than fine. I wanted to talk to you about something important. I settled into my favorite chair, the one by the window that looked out over the fields where Earl used to graze cattle. Is everything okay? You sound serious. Everything's okay, but there have been some developments with Michael that I think you should know about. I told her the whole story, from the obituary test to the lawyer visits to my decision to revise my will. Sarah listened without interrupting, though I could hear her sharp intake of breath when I described Michael's attempts to have me declared incompetent. Mom, I'm so sorry. I had no idea Michael was putting you through this. He's mentioned being concerned about you a few times when we've talked, but he made it sound like normal worrying, not like he was actively trying to undermine your independence. What exactly did he say to you? Sarah was quiet for a moment, clearly thinking back through their conversations. He said you'd been more forgetful lately, that you sometimes repeated yourself or got confused about dates. He asked if I'd noticed anything when we talked on the phone. I told him no, that you seemed exactly the same to me, maybe a little lonelier since Dad died, but certainly not confused or incompetent. Did he ask you anything else? He wanted to know if you'd ever talked to me about estate planning or making changes to your will. I told him that wasn't really any of my business, that you were perfectly capable of handling your own affairs. Sarah's voice was getting tighter, anger creeping in as she processed the implications of Michael's questions. Mom, was he trying to get me to support his claims about your mental state? That's exactly what he was doing. He was building a case, gathering evidence from family members to support his theory that I was declining. I explained Frank's assessment of the situation, the legal strategies that families sometimes use to gain control of elderly relatives' assets. This is disgusting, Sarah said. Mom, you're one of the sharpest people I know. You manage that entire property by yourself. You keep track of all your finances. You remember every birthday and anniversary and important date in our family. The idea that anyone would question your competence is absurd. Well, Michael's questioning it, and he's gotten Jennifer to go along with him. They brought legal papers to my kitchen table, Sarah. They wanted me to sign away my right to make my own decisions. Sarah was quiet for a long time. When she spoke again, her voice was steel. What can I do to help? We talked for another hour, discussing the practical implications of my decision to change the will. Sarah was completely supportive, even though it meant she and Lisa would inherit more than they'd originally expected. She was also furious about Michael's behavior, and she promised to document any future conversations with him about my mental state. Mom, I think you should call Lisa too, Sarah said before we hung up. She should know what's happening, especially since she lives closer and might be in a position to observe Michael's behavior firsthand. I was planning to call her tomorrow. I want all my children to understand what's happening and why I'm making these decisions. Well, all my children except Michael. Are you going to tell him about the will changes? I had been wrestling with this question for days. Not yet. Frank thinks it's better to let the changes take effect first, make sure everything is legally solid. If Michael knows about them now, he might escalate his efforts to have me declared incompetent before the new will is finalized. After I hung up with Sarah, I sat in my kitchen with a cup of tea and thought about the strange way families can fracture. 4 children, raised in the same house by the same parents, taught the same values and given the same opportunities. 3 of them had grown into adults who respected my autonomy and trusted my judgment. 1 had decided I was a problem to be managed rather than a person to be loved. The next morning brought an unexpected visitor. I was washing breakfast dishes when I saw Jennifer's car pull into my driveway. She came to the door alone, without Michael or the boys, carrying a covered dish that smelled like her famous tuna casserole. Dorothy, I brought you some lunch, she said when I opened the door. Her smile seemed strained, and she wasn't meeting my eyes directly. I invited her in, curious about what had prompted this solo visit. Jennifer had never been the type to drop by unannounced, and she'd certainly never brought me food before. We sat at the kitchen table while I served us both portions of the casserole, which was actually quite good despite my complicated feelings about its maker. Dorothy, I wanted to apologize for the other day, Jennifer said eventually. I think Michael and I came on too strong with all that legal paperwork. We were worried about you, but we didn't handle it very well. I studied her face, trying to read the motivation behind this sudden olive branch. What exactly are you apologizing for, Jennifer? For making you feel like we don't trust your judgment. For bringing lawyers into your home without giving you more warning about what we wanted to discuss. For treating you like you couldn't understand what was happening. The apology sounded rehearsed, like something she'd practiced in the car on the way over. Did Michael send you here? Jennifer's composure cracked slightly. He doesn't know I'm here. We've been arguing about the whole situation since we left your house. I told him I thought he was being too aggressive, that he was pushing you away instead of helping you. And what did he say to that? He said I didn't understand how serious the situation was, that you were more impaired than I realized, that someone needed to take charge before you made a mistake that couldn't be fixed. Jennifer set down her fork and looked at me directly for the first time since she'd arrived. Dorothy, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest with me. Are you having problems with your memory? Are you confused about things more often than you used to be? The question hung in the air between us like a challenge. I could see that Jennifer was genuinely conflicted, caught between her husband's certainty and her own observations of my behavior. Jennifer, I want you to think back over all the times we've spent together in the past year, I said. All the family dinners, the holiday celebrations, the casual conversations. Have I ever seemed confused to you? Have I repeated myself excessively, or forgotten important information, or lost track of where I was in a conversation? She considered this carefully. No, she said slowly. You've always seemed completely normal to me. Sharp, actually. You remember details about the boys' school activities that I sometimes forget myself. Then why are you supporting Michael's claims that I'm incompetent? Jennifer looked down at her hands, clearly uncomfortable. Because he's my husband, and he's convinced that he's protecting you. He's shown me examples of things you've said or done that concern him. The obituary incident, the repeated questions, the confusion about dates and appointments. The obituary incident was a setup, Jennifer. Michael deliberately planted old newspapers with my current ones to see if I'd notice. That's not a test of my competence, that's manipulation. Jennifer's eyes widened. He told me you'd gotten confused reading the paper, that you'd called about a funeral for someone who died decades ago. That's technically true, but he left out the part where he'd deliberately created the confusion. I pulled out the notebook where I'd been documenting Michael's behavior and showed her the entries about our recent interactions. Look at this pattern, Jennifer. Look at the way he's been setting me up to fail, then using my responses as evidence that I'm declining. Jennifer read through several pages of the notebook, her expression growing more troubled with each entry. Dorothy, I had no idea he was doing this. He made it sound like you were naturally becoming more confused, not that he was creating situations to make you seem confused. Now you're starting to understand why I'm angry. My own son has been gaslighting me, systematically undermining my confidence so he could justify taking control of my life. And he's convinced you to be complicit in it. Jennifer closed the notebook and pushed it back across the table to me. What can I do to make this right? You can stop supporting his campaign against my independence. You can refuse to participate in any more legal maneuvers designed to declare me incompetent. And you can help me protect Jake and Josh from being used as pawns in this family conflict. The boys have been asking questions since that day we all came over here. They said you seemed completely normal to them, and they couldn't understand why their father was talking about you like you were sick. What did you tell them? I told them it was complicated, that adults sometimes disagreed about what was best for each other. Jennifer paused, clearly struggling with something. But Dorothy, after seeing that notebook, after thinking about all our interactions over the past year, I'm starting to think the boys were right. You don't seem impaired to me. You seem like yourself. We finished lunch in relative silence, both of us processing the implications of this conversation. When Jennifer prepared to leave, she turned to me at the door. Dorothy, what are you going to do about Michael? I'm going to protect myself, I said. I'm going to make sure that if anything happens to me, my wishes are respected, and my property goes to people who actually care about me, rather than just my assets. Are you changing your will? I looked at this woman who'd been part of my family for 12 years, who'd given me grandsons I adored, who was married to a son I was learning not to trust. Jennifer, I think the less you know about my legal arrangements, the better. That way, if Michael asks you questions, you can honestly say you don't have information. She nodded, understanding the wisdom of this approach. Will you call me if you need anything? If Michael does, something that makes you feel unsafe or threatened? Are you offering to be my ally in this? Jennifer hesitated, clearly torn between loyalty to her husband and her growing recognition of what was actually happening. I'm offering to be honest about what I observe. I won't support claims about your competence that I don't believe are true. After she left, I felt a complex mixture of relief and sadness. Relief that I might have an ally within Michael's household, someone who could provide a reality check on his increasingly aggressive behavior. Sadness that my family had fractured to the point where I needed allies and strategies rather than simple love and respect. That afternoon, I called Lisa in Sioux Falls. As the nurse in the family, she had medical knowledge that might be helpful in understanding and documenting my cognitive status. She also lived close enough to visit regularly, which meant she'd have current observations of my behavior rather than relying on Michael's second-hand reports. "Mom, this is terrible," Lisa said after I'd explained the situation. "I can't believe Michael is putting you through this. You're obviously completely competent. Anyone who spends 5 minutes with you can see that." "Lisa, I need to ask you something professional. In your experience as a nurse, what are the actual signs of cognitive decline that would make someone unable to manage their own affairs?" Lisa launched into a detailed explanation of different types of dementia, the progression of symptoms, and the assessment tools that medical professionals use to evaluate cognitive function. None of the behaviors Michael had cited would constitute evidence of significant impairment in a clinical setting. "Mom, what Michael is describing sounds like normal aging. Everyone becomes a little more forgetful as they get older. Everyone occasionally repeats themselves or takes longer to retrieve information. That's not dementia, that's being human. That's what Dr. Morrison said when I asked him to evaluate me. You had yourself professionally evaluated? That was brilliant. Now you have objective medical evidence of your competence, if anyone challenges it." We talked about the legal implications of my situation, and Lisa offered to document any interactions she had with Michael about my mental state. As a medical professional, her testimony about my cognitive function would carry particular weight if the situation ever ended up in court. "Mom, I want you to know that whatever decisions you make about your estate, I'll support them completely. You've earned the right to control your own property and your own life. No one should be able to take that away from you just because they think they know better." That evening, I sat on my front porch watching the sun set over the prairie, thinking about the strange turn my life had taken. 6 months ago, my biggest concerns were whether to replant the vegetable garden and when to schedule maintenance on the old tractor Earl had left me. Now I was documenting family interactions like evidence for a trial and revising legal documents to protect myself from my own son. But I also felt stronger than I had in years. Standing up to Michael's manipulation had reminded me that I was still capable of fighting for myself, still sharp enough to recognize threats and strategic enough to counter them. I might be 73 years old, but I wasn't ready to hand over control of my life to anyone, especially not to someone who'd proven he couldn't be trusted with that kind of power. The next few weeks passed quietly, without any contact from Michael. I wondered if Jennifer had talked to him about her visit, if she'd shared her doubts about his claims regarding my competence. Part of me hoped they might work things out between themselves, that Michael might come to his senses and apologize for his behavior. But a larger part of me suspected that his silence meant he was regrouping, planning his next move in what had become an undeclared war over my autonomy. I used the quiet time to finalize my legal arrangements with Frank, to document my daily activities and mental processes, and to strengthen my relationships with Sarah, Lisa, and my grandchildren. I also began reaching out to neighbors and old friends, people who'd known me for decades, and could testify to my continued competence if necessary. The peace couldn't last forever, and it ended on a cold November morning when I found Michael waiting by my mailbox as I returned from my weekly grocery trip to town. He looked older than he had just a few weeks earlier, more haggard, and there was something in his expression that made me wary as I pulled into my driveway. "Mom, we need to talk," he said as I got out of my car. "There are some things we need to clear up." I looked at my son, this man I'd carried for 9 months and raised for 18 years, who'd learned to walk in my kitchen and taken his first steps toward my outstretched arms. Somewhere along the way, he'd stopped seeing me as his mother and started seeing me as an obstacle. The realization broke my heart even as it strengthened my resolve. "Michael, if you're here to pressure me about legal documents again, I'm not interested. I'm here because I know what you've been doing," he said, his voice tight with controlled anger. "I know about the will changes, Mom, and I know about the things you've been telling people about me." The confrontation I'd been dreading had finally arrived. My blood turned to ice water in my veins as I stared at Michael standing beside my mailbox, his face flushed with cold and something darker. The grocery bags in my hands suddenly felt impossibly heavy, and I had to resist the urge to step backward toward my car. Instead, I lifted my chin and met his gaze directly. "I don't know what you think you know, Michael, but I suggest you be very careful about making accusations you can't prove. I hired a private investigator, Mom. His words came out in visible puffs of vapor in the frigid air. I needed to document your behavior patterns, your daily activities, your mental state. I needed evidence for when we go to court. The audacity of it hit me like a physical blow. My own son had paid a stranger to spy on me, to follow me around town and document my movements like I was a criminal under surveillance. I thought about all the errands I'd run in recent weeks, all the conversations with neighbors and friends, wondering who had been watching, taking notes, building a case against my independence. You had me followed? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. I had your activities documented, Michael corrected, as if the distinction mattered. The investigator has been tracking your routine for 3 weeks now. He's documented several concerning incidents. I set my grocery bags down on the hood of my car, needing to free my hands in case this conversation escalated beyond words. What kind of incidents? Michael pulled out his phone and began reading from what was obviously a written report. October 15th, subject spent 45 minutes walking aimlessly through Walmart, appearing confused and disoriented. October 18th, subject had a heated argument with a bank teller about account information she couldn't remember. October 22nd, subject was observed talking to herself while sitting alone in her car outside the pharmacy. Each alleged incident felt like a knife twist, not because they were true, but because of how easily normal behavior could be twisted into evidence of incompetence. Michael, do you want to know what actually happened on those days? I know what happened. It's all documented. On October 15th, I was looking for a specific type of yarn for a baby blanket I'm knitting for the church nursery. I walked through several aisles because I wanted to compare colors and textures. On October 18th, I questioned why the bank had charged me a fee I'd never seen before, and the teller couldn't explain it until she called her supervisor. And on October 22nd, I was practicing a speech I was giving at the Historical Society about farming in the 1970s. Michael's expression didn't change. He'd already decided what these incidents meant, and no alternative explanation was going to penetrate his certainty. Mom, you're making excuses for behavior that clearly shows cognitive decline. I'm explaining normal activities that your spy misinterpreted because he doesn't know me and he was looking for problems rather than observing reality. The investigator is a professional with experience in elder care assessment. The investigator is someone you paid to build a case against me. I picked up my grocery bags and started walking toward the house. If you want to continue this conversation, we're doing it inside where it's warm. But Michael, I'm warning you, if you've come here to threaten me or pressure me into signing legal documents, this conversation is going to be very short. He followed me into the kitchen, stamping snow off his boots on the mat Earl had made from old feed sacks. The familiar domestic action looked strange and wrong, given the hostile nature of his visit. I unpacked my groceries with deliberate calm, refusing to let him see how much his surveillance revelation had shaken me. Mom, I also know about your meetings with Frank Jorgensen. I know you've been making changes to your will. I turned to face him, a box of crackers still in my hand. How do you know that? The investigator documented your visits to his office. He also spoke with some people around town about your recent behavior. He spoke with people about me? What people? Michael consulted his phone again. Evelyn Larson reported that you've been asking strange questions about memory and aging. The pharmacist said you've seemed more scattered lately when picking up prescriptions. The woman at the post office mentioned that you've been mailing unusual amounts of correspondence. Each revelation felt like another violation. Not only had Michael hired someone to spy on me, but that person had been going around town asking my neighbors and acquaintances to gossip about my personal business. In a small community like ours, where everyone knew everyone else's business anyway, this kind of formal inquiry would have people talking for months. Michael, what you've done is unconscionable. You've hired a stranger to invade my privacy and spread rumors about my mental health throughout the community. I've documented evidence of your declining capacity so I can protect you from making decisions you'll regret. You've created a narrative to justify taking away my legal rights. I slammed the box of crackers down on the counter harder than I'd intended. And you've destroyed my reputation in this town in the process. Your reputation isn't my primary concern, your safety is. My safety from what? From living my own life? From making my own choices? Michael, the only threat to my safety right now is you. He stepped closer, and for the first time in this entire ordeal, I felt physically intimidated by my own son. Michael was tall and broad-shouldered like his father, and he was using his physical presence to try to dominate the conversation. Mom, I know you've removed me from your will. I know you've been telling lies about me to Sarah and Lisa. I know you've been trying to turn my own children against me. I haven't told anyone any lies, Michael. I've told them exactly what you've been doing, which is trying to have me declared incompetent so you can control my property. I've been trying to protect family assets from being squandered by someone who's losing the ability to make rational decisions. The mask was finally slipping. This wasn't about my welfare or my safety. This was about money, about property, about Michael's assumption that he was entitled to inherit everything I'd worked for. Michael, I want you to listen to me very carefully, I said, moving to put the kitchen island between us. I am 73 years old, but I am not senile, confused, or incompetent. I have been professionally evaluated by my physician and found to be cognitively normal for my age. I have the legal right to make decisions about my own property, including decisions about who will inherit it. You're making those decisions based on emotional reactions rather than rational planning. I'm making those decisions based on how my children have treated me. You've spent months trying to convince me I'm losing my mind. You've manipulated situations to make me look confused. You've brought lawyers to my home to pressure me into signing away my rights. And now you've hired a private investigator to spy on me and spread gossip about me throughout my community. Michael's face was getting redder. Whether from anger or cold, I couldn't tell. Everything I've done has been to protect you and preserve what Dad worked so hard to build. Your father worked hard to build a life for his family, not an inheritance for his children. He wanted me to be taken care of, not controlled. There's a difference, Michael, and if you can't see it, then you don't deserve to benefit from his labor. So you're punishing me for caring about you. I'm protecting myself from someone who's proven he can't be trusted with power over my life. Michael pulled out a manila envelope from his coat pocket and slapped it down on the kitchen counter. Mom, this is a petition to have you declared legally incompetent. I've already filed it with the county court. The words hit me like a physical blow. I stared at the envelope, afraid to touch it, afraid to see my own name on legal documents declaring me unfit to manage my own affairs. You've already filed it? Yesterday afternoon. The court date is set for December 3rd. You'll need to appear and defend your mental capacity before a judge. Michael, how could you do this to me? Because I love you too much to watch you destroy everything our family has built. His voice was getting louder, more aggressive. Because someone has to be the adult in this situation and make the hard decisions. The adult? Michael, I'm your mother. I raised you, I taught you right from wrong, I sacrificed for years to give you opportunities. And this is how you repay me? By dragging me into court and trying to have me declared mentally incompetent? I'm trying to save you from yourself. I picked up the envelope with trembling hands and pulled out the legal documents inside. The language was formal and cold, full of whereas clauses and legal terminology, but the basic message was clear. Michael was asking a judge to declare me legally incapable of managing my own affairs, and to appoint him as my guardian with full authority over my finances, my property, and my personal decisions. Michael, if you succeed with this petition, I lose everything. I lose the right to live in my own home, to make my own medical decisions, to choose how to spend my own money. You're asking a court to treat me like a child. I'm asking a court to protect you from making irreversible mistakes while you still have assets left to protect. What mistakes? What have I done that's so terrible that I need to be declared incompetent? Michael pulled out his phone again and began reading from what was obviously a prepared list. You've been observed behaving erratically in public. You've been asking inappropriate questions about memory and aging. You've been making sudden changes to important legal documents without consulting your family. You've been spreading false accusations about family members who are trying to help you. Michael, everything on that list is either a misinterpretation of normal behavior or a normal response to your attempts to undermine my independence. That's your perception. but the court will have to decide based on objective evidence. What objective evidence? The report from a private investigator you paid to find problems? Gossip from people around town who were asked leading questions about my behavior? The court will also consider testimony from family members about observed changes in your cognitive function. A new horror dawned on me. Who else is supporting this petition? Michael's silence was answer enough. Jennifer is willing to testify about her observations of your behavior. She's documented several concerning incidents over the past few months. Jennifer came to my house 2 weeks ago and told me she thought you were wrong about my mental state. Jennifer has been conflicted about the situation, but she ultimately agrees that something needs to be done to protect you. I thought about Jennifer's visit, her apparent sympathy, her promise to be honest about what she observed. Had that entire conversation been a setup, a way to gather more information for Michael's case against me? Or had Michael pressured her afterward to change her position? What about Jake and Josh? Are you planning to put your own children on the witness stand to testify against their grandmother? The boys won't be involved unless absolutely necessary. But Mom, they've expressed concerns about some of your behavior too. This was the cruelest cut of all. My grandsons, who'd sat in my kitchen just weeks earlier, saying I seemed completely normal to them, were now supposedly concerned about my mental state. Either Michael was lying about their position, or he'd been working on them since that confrontation, convincing them that their initial perceptions were wrong. Michael, I want you to leave now. Mom, we need to finish this conversation. We need to discuss your options. My options? You've just told me you filed legal papers to have me declared incompetent. What options do I have left? You can cooperate with the evaluation process. You can agree to voluntary guardianship arrangements that would be less restrictive than what the court might impose. You can accept help managing your affairs before the situation gets worse. Or, I can fight this petition and prove that you're wrong about my mental capacity. Michael's expression hardened. If you fight this, Mom, everything becomes public record. Everyone in town will know about your cognitive issues, your family conflicts, your financial situation. Is that really what you want? What I want is for my son to stop trying to destroy my life. I moved toward the kitchen door, making it clear that this conversation was over. What I want is for you to remember that I'm your mother, not your enemy. I'm trying to protect you, Mom. I'm trying to preserve what Dad built for all of us. Your father built a life based on love and respect. You're destroying that legacy with your greed and your need to control everyone around you. Michael picked up the manila envelope and headed toward the door. The court date is December 3rd at 10 a.m. You should bring an attorney. I already have an attorney. And Michael? I'm going to fight this with everything I have. I hope you'll reconsider, for everyone's sake. After he left, I stood alone in my kitchen, surrounded by the familiar comfort of 40 years' worth of memories, and felt more frightened than I had since Earl's death. Michael hadn't just threatened my independence, he'd weaponized the legal system against me. Even if I won in court, the process would be humiliating and expensive. Win or lose, my reputation in the community would be permanently damaged by the public suggestion that I was mentally incompetent. I called Frank Jorgensen immediately, even though it was after office hours. He answered on the third ring, and I could hear the television in the background. Frank, Michael has filed a competency petition against me. The court date is December 3rd RD. There was a long pause. Dorothy, I was afraid this might happen. We need to meet tomorrow morning to discuss our defense strategy. Frank, is there any chance he could actually win this thing? Dorothy, competency hearings are serious legal proceedings. The standard is whether you're able to understand and make reasoned decisions about your own affairs. Based on my interactions with you and your medical evaluation, I don't believe Michael can meet that burden. But we need to be prepared for a fight. What kind of fight? Michael will present evidence of alleged cognitive decline. We'll counter with evidence of your continued competency. The judge will make a decision based on the totality of the evidence. What happens if I lose? Frank's pause was longer this time. If the court finds you incompetent, Michael would be appointed as your guardian. He would have legal authority to make decisions about your finances, your property, your living arrangements, even your medical care. Could he force me to move out of my house? If he convinced the court it was in your best interest, yes. Could he override my will? A guardian has broad authority to manage an incapacitated person's affairs. Your existing will would remain valid, but he could potentially influence future changes. I sank into a kitchen chair, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what Michael was attempting. He wasn't just trying to inherit my property, he was trying to erase my legal existence as an autonomous adult human being. Frank, what do I need to do to defend myself? We need to document your competency as thoroughly as possible. We need witness testimony about your cognitive function. We need to counter every piece of evidence Michael presents with stronger evidence of your mental capacity. What about the private investigator's report? We'll challenge its accuracy and methodology. We'll point out that the investigator was paid to find evidence of incompetency, which creates a bias in his observations. That night, I called Sarah and Lisa to tell them about Michael's petition. Both of them were horrified and immediately offered to testify on my behalf. Sarah said she would fly in from Oregon for the hearing, and Lisa promised to bring medical records and professional documentation of my cognitive status. But as I lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling and listening to the wind howl across the prairie, I couldn't shake the feeling that the damage was already done. Win or lose, Michael had succeeded in calling my competency into question publicly. Everyone in town would know that my own son thought I was mentally unfit to manage my own affairs. The next morning brought an unexpected visitor. Evelyn Larson knocked on my door just after breakfast, carrying a casserole dish and wearing an expression of righteous indignation. "Dorothy Peterson, I have something to say to you," she announced as she bustled into my kitchen. "Yesterday afternoon, some man came to my house asking questions about your behavior. He wanted to know if I'd noticed you becoming more forgetful or confused." I poured us both coffee while Evelyn settled herself at the kitchen table like a general preparing for battle. "What did you tell him?" "I told him that you're one of the sharpest people I know, and that anyone questioning your mental capacity is either blind or has ulterior motives." Evelyn's eyes flashed with anger. "Then I asked him who was paying him to spread gossip about you, and he got all flustered and said he couldn't discuss the details of his investigation. Evie, I need to tell you something that's going to upset you even more." I explained about Michael's competency petition, about the court hearing scheduled for December 3rd, about the months of manipulation and psychological warfare that had led to this moment. Evelyn listened with growing outrage, occasionally muttering under her breath about ungrateful children and family loyalty. "Dorothy, this is the most disgraceful thing I've ever heard. Your son ought to be ashamed of himself. Will you testify for me at the hearing? Will you tell the judge what you've observed about my mental state?" "I'll do more than that," Evelyn said firmly. "I'll call every person in this county who knows you and ask them to be character witnesses. We'll show that judge exactly how competent you are." "Evie, I appreciate your support, but I don't want to turn this into a community battle. I just want to defend my right to live my own life." "Honey, Michael made this a community battle when he sent that investigator around town asking people to gossip about you. Now it's time for the community to fight back." Over the next few days, word of Michael's petition spread through town with the speed that only small-town gossip can achieve. I found myself fielding phone calls from neighbors, friends, acquaintances, and even casual business contacts, all expressing support and outrage about the situation. The pharmacist called to clarify that he'd never said anything negative about my mental state to any investigator. The postmaster wanted to know if I needed any documentation of my regular correspondence patterns. Most surprisingly, I received a visit from Jake and Josh, Michael's twin sons. They showed up on Saturday afternoon looking uncomfortable but determined, asking if they could talk to me privately. "Grandma Dorothy, Dad told us about the court thing," Jake said. "He said we might have to testify about whether you seem confused or forgetful." "What did you tell him?" "We told him the truth," Josh said. "That you seem exactly the same to us as you always have. Maybe a little sadder since Grandpa Earl died, but not confused or weird or anything." Dad didn't like that answer. Jake added. He said we weren't paying close enough attention, that we needed to think harder about times when you seemed off or different. I felt a surge of pride in these young men who were refusing to be manipulated into supporting their father's campaign against me. Boys, I want you to know that whatever happens in court, I don't expect you to take sides between your father and me. This is an adult conflict, and you shouldn't be put in the middle of it. But Grandma, if someone asks us questions in court, we're going to tell the truth, Josh said. You don't seem crazy or confused to us. You seem like yourself. Dad's been acting really weird about this whole thing, Jake added. He keeps asking us questions about your behavior and getting mad when we don't give him the answers he wants. After the boys left, I sat on my front porch despite the cold, watching the sun set over the fields that had been my home for 5 decades. In less than 2 weeks, I would stand before a judge and defend my right to continue living as an independent adult. The outcome would determine whether I spent my remaining years as a free woman or as a legal ward of a son who'd proven he couldn't be trusted with my welfare. But as I watched the last light fade from the western sky, I felt something unexpected. Determination. Michael had underestimated me. He'd assumed that because I was older, I would be easier to intimidate and control. He'd counted on my desire to avoid family conflict to make me submit to his demands. He was about to learn just how wrong he'd been about his mother's character. I'd spent 7 decades learning to be strong, and I wasn't about to stop now. The courthouse in Brookings was a stately brick building that had witnessed decades of family disputes, criminal trials, and civil disagreements. As I climbed the front steps on that frigid December morning, my breath forming clouds in the bitter air, I tried not to think about all the other people who had walked these same steps to fight for their freedom, their dignity, their very right to exist as autonomous human beings. Frank Jorgensen met me in the lobby, carrying a briefcase that looked reassuringly thick with documents. He wore his best suit and his most serious expression, the look of a man who understood that this wasn't just another legal proceeding, but a battle for someone's fundamental human rights. Dorothy, are you ready for this? He asked, his voice gentle but firm. As ready as I'll ever be to defend my sanity to a room full of strangers, I replied, trying to inject some humor into a situation that felt anything but funny. Remember what we discussed. Answer questions directly and honestly. Don't let Michael's attorney bait you into losing your temper. Show the judge the same clear thinking and steady judgment you've shown me for 25 years. We walked into the courtroom together, and I was surprised by how many people had come to support me. Evelyn and Tom Larson sat in the front row, along with Sarah, who had flown in from Oregon the night before. Lisa was there in her nurse's uniform, having taken time off work to be present. Several neighbors I'd known for decades filled the other seats, creating an impressive show of community support. On the other side of the courtroom sat Michael, Jennifer, and Robert Chen, the attorney who had first brought those guardianship papers to my kitchen table. They looked isolated and outnumbered, which gave me a small surge of satisfaction despite the gravity of the situation. Judge Patricia Williams entered the courtroom with the bearing of someone who had presided over countless family tragedies and legal disputes. She was a woman in her 50s with silver hair and intelligent eyes that seemed to take in every detail of the scene before her. I found myself hoping that her gender and apparent experience would make her more sensitive to the nuances of family manipulation, though I knew I couldn't count on assumptions about her perspective. This is a petition for guardianship filed by Michael Peterson, seeking to be appointed guardian of the person and estate of Dorothy Mae Peterson, Judge Williams announced. Mr. Chen, you may present your case. Robert Chen stood and approached the bench with the confidence of someone who had argued similar cases many times before. Your Honor, we're here today because the Peterson family is facing a difficult but unfortunately common situation. Mrs. Dorothy Peterson, while still a beloved family member, has begun showing signs of cognitive decline that make her unable to safely manage her own affairs. The phrase cognitive decline hung in the air like an accusation. I forced myself to remain calm, to keep my expression neutral, even as every fiber of my being wanted to stand up and shout that I was perfectly capable of managing my own life. We will present evidence that Mrs. Peterson has become increasingly forgetful, confused about basic daily activities, and prone to making irrational decisions that could endanger her financial security and physical safety, Chen continued. Her family has tried to work with her voluntarily to put appropriate safeguards in place, but she has refused all assistance and has recently made drastic changes to her estate planning that suggest impaired judgment. I listened to this characterization of my life and my behavior with growing anger. Everything Chen said was technically true if you removed all context and motivation. Yes, I had refused their assistance. Yes, I had made changes to my estate planning. But the reasons behind these actions were completely ignored in his presentation. Your Honor, we will also present testimony from a professional investigator who has documented Mrs. Peterson's concerning behavior patterns over the past several weeks, Chen said, pulling out a thick folder. This evidence will show that Mrs. Peterson requires the protection and oversight that only a court-appointed guardianship can provide. Judge Williams nodded and made notes on the papers before her. Mr. Chen, please call your first witness. We call Michael Peterson to the stand. I watched my youngest son walk to the witness stand and raise his right hand to be sworn in. He looked nervous but determined, and I found myself wondering if he truly believed what he was about to say or if he had convinced himself that the ends justified the means. Mr. Peterson, what is your relationship to the respondent? Dorothy Peterson is my mother. I'm her youngest child. Can you describe your mother's living situation? Michael launched into a detailed description of my daily life that sounded reasonable on the surface, but was designed to highlight every potential area of concern. He talked about me living alone on a large property, managing my own finances, making my own medical decisions, and maintaining social relationships without family oversight. Mr. Peterson, have you observed changes in your mother's cognitive function over the past year? Yes, significant changes. She's become more forgetful, more confused about dates and appointments. She repeats herself frequently, and sometimes seems disoriented about time and place. I gripped the arms of my chair as Michael systematically cataloged every normal sign of aging as evidence of incompetence. He described the incident with Harold Gustafson's obituary without mentioning that he had deliberately planted old newspapers to confuse me. He talked about my questions about memory and aging without explaining that they were prompted by his own accusations about my mental state. Has your mother made any recent decisions that concern you? She's made sudden and dramatic changes to her will without consulting any family members. She's removed me as a beneficiary and has been making accusations about my motives that suggest paranoid thinking. The word paranoid hit me like a slap. Michael was characterizing my reasonable response to his manipulation as mental illness, turning my self-defense into evidence of cognitive decline. Mr. Peterson, have you attempted to discuss these concerns with your mother? We've tried repeatedly to have rational conversations about putting appropriate safeguards in place. We've offered to help her manage her finances and legal affairs, but she's become increasingly hostile and suspicious of family members who are trying to help her. Frank leaned over and whispered in my ear. He's painting a picture of a paranoid, hostile woman who's lost touch with reality. We'll counter this in our cross-examination. Chen continued questioning Michael for another 20 minutes, building a narrative of a confused elderly woman making irrational decisions and rejecting reasonable family assistance. Michael's testimony was smooth and practiced, suggesting he had rehearsed these talking points many times. When Frank stood to cross-examine Michael, I could see the subtle shift in the courtroom's energy. Frank had known our family for decades, and his questions carried the weight of personal knowledge rather than just legal strategy. Mr. Peterson, you testified that your mother has become more forgetful. Can you give the court specific examples of important information she's forgotten? Michael hesitated. She's forgotten appointments, repeated conversations, asked the same questions multiple times. Have you forgotten appointments in the past year, Mr. Peterson? Well, yes, but that's different. How is it different? I'm not 73 years old. So you're saying that some degree of forgetfulness is normal for someone your mother's age? Michael looked uncomfortable. Some degree, yes, but not to the extent we've observed. Frank pulled out a document. Mr. Peterson, I have here a report from Dr. Morrison, your mother's physician, dated just 6 weeks ago. Are you familiar with this report? No. This report documents a comprehensive cognitive assessment that your mother requested. According to Dr. Morrison, your mother scored within normal ranges for her age group on all measures of memory, reasoning, and judgment. Were you aware that your mother had undergone professional cognitive testing? No, I wasn't. Did you consider having your mother professionally evaluated before filing this petition? Michael's attorney objected, but Judge Williams allowed the question. We felt that family observations were sufficient to identify the problem. Mr. Peterson, you testified that your mother planted old obituaries in current newspapers to confuse herself? No, I said she became confused reading obituaries. But you did deliberately mix old newspapers with current ones as a test of her cognitive function, didn't you? Michael's face flushed. I was trying to assess whether she was paying attention to details. You were deliberately creating confusion to see if your mother would notice? I was conducting an informal assessment. Without her knowledge or consent? Yes. Frank let that admission hang in the air for a moment before continuing. Mr. Peterson, you hired a private investigator to follow your mother around town, didn't you? I hired someone to document her behavior patterns. You had your mother surveilled without her knowledge? I needed objective documentation of her activities. And you instructed this investigator to interview people around town about your mother's behavior? He was gathering information from people who interact with her regularly. Did you consider how this investigation might affect your mother's reputation in the community? Michael's discomfort was becoming obvious. Her reputation is less important than her safety. Mr. Peterson, you brought legal documents to your mother's home and pressured her to sign away her legal rights, didn't you? We brought options for her to consider. Options that would have given you legal authority over her finances, her property, and her personal decisions? Yes, but only to protect her interests. Mr. Peterson, in your opinion, what would constitute appropriate living arrangements for your mother? Michael hesitated, clearly realizing this was a trap. Whatever arrangements would ensure her safety and proper care, would those arrangements include your mother continuing to live independently in her own home? If appropriate supervision could be arranged. Supervision by whom? By family members or professional caregivers. So your vision of protecting your mother involves her losing the right to live alone in the home she's occupied for 50 years? If necessary for her safety, yes. Frank nodded and returned to his seat. Michael's cross-examination had revealed the controlling nature of his agenda and the questionable methods he'd used to build his case against me. The next witness was the private investigator, a thin man with a nervous manner who looked uncomfortable being in court. His testimony about my, quote, concerning behavior patterns fell apart under Frank's cross-examination when it became clear that he had no expertise in geriatric assessment and had been specifically instructed to look for evidence of cognitive decline. When Chen called Jennifer as a witness, I felt a stab of betrayal despite everything that had happened. Jennifer testified reluctantly about her observations of my behavior, but her testimony lacked conviction. Under cross-examination, she admitted that she had never seen any behavior that would suggest serious cognitive impairment. Mrs. Peterson, did you ever express concerns about Dorothy Peterson's mental capacity before your husband began this guardianship proceeding? No, I didn't see any significant problems. What changed your perception? Jennifer glanced at Michael before answering. My husband pointed out things I hadn't noticed before. So your concerns are based on your husband's interpretation of Dorothy Peterson's behavior rather than your own independent observations. I suppose that's accurate. The prosecution's case was weaker than I had feared, but I knew that the burden of proof in competency hearings could be relatively low. Judge Williams would have to decide whether there was sufficient evidence to justify stripping away my fundamental rights as an adult. When Frank called me to testify on my own behalf, I felt a mixture of nervousness and determination. This was my chance to speak directly to the judge, to demonstrate my cognitive capacity and explain my perspective on everything that had happened. Frank's questions were designed to showcase my mental acuity and my understanding of my own situation. I explained my daily routine, my financial management, my social activities, and my decision-making processes. I talked about the cognitive assessment I had requested from Dr. Morrison and the reasons behind my estate planning changes. Mrs. Peterson, why did you remove your son Michael from your will? Because he has demonstrated that he's more interested in controlling my life than supporting my independence. He's used manipulation and psychological pressure to try to convince me that I'm incompetent. I don't trust him to respect my autonomy or my wishes. Are you concerned about your memory or your ability to make decisions? I'm 73 years old. I'm not as quick as I was at 40, and I occasionally forget minor details, but I'm fully capable of understanding complex information, weighing options, and making informed decisions about my own life. Mrs. Peterson, if this guardianship is granted, how would it affect your life? It would end my life as an independent adult. I would become a legal ward, unable to make decisions about where I live, how I spend my money, or even what medical care I receive. At my age, losing that independence would be devastating. Chen's cross-examination was more aggressive, designed to rattle me and make me appear confused or hostile. He asked rapid-fire questions about dates, names, and financial details, trying to catch me in inconsistencies or gaps in memory. Mrs. Peterson, what did you have for breakfast 3 days ago? I don't remember specifically, but it was probably toast and coffee, which is what I have most mornings. So you don't remember what you ate 3 days ago? Do you remember what you had for breakfast 3 days ago, Mr. Chen? Judge Williams intervened. The witness will answer the questions without asking her own. Chen continued this line of questioning for several minutes, treating normal gaps in memory as evidence of cognitive decline. But I remained calm and answered each question thoughtfully, demonstrating the very mental capacity he was trying to disprove. The final witnesses were character witnesses, who testified about their observations of my behavior and mental state. Evelyn Larson was particularly effective, describing decades of friendship and recent interactions that showed no signs of cognitive impairment. Dr. Morrison testified by telephone about my cognitive assessment, explaining that my test results were well within normal ranges for someone my age. He emphasized that aging involves some changes in processing speed and memory, but that these changes don't constitute incapacity. Sarah and Lisa both testified about their regular contact with me and their observations of my continued competence. Their testimony as my daughters carried particular weight, especially since they had no financial interest in the outcome of the case. After closing arguments, Judge Williams announced that she would take the matter under advisement and issue a written decision within 2 weeks. The courtroom emptied slowly, with my supporters clustering around me to offer encouragement and Michael's group leaving quickly without making eye contact. As I walked down the courthouse steps, I felt emotionally drained but cautiously optimistic. I had presented strong evidence of my continued competence, and Michael's case had revealed itself to be built more on manipulation than genuine concern for my welfare. But I also knew that the next 2 weeks would be the longest of my life, as I waited to learn whether I would remain a free woman or become a legal ward of the son who had betrayed my trust so completely. The phone call came on a Tuesday morning while I was feeding the birds outside my kitchen window. Frank's voice was steady, but I could hear the smile behind his words before he even delivered the news. Dorothy, Judge Williams has issued her decision. The petition for guardianship has been denied. I sank into my kitchen chair, relief flooding through me like warm honey. What exactly did she say? She found no credible evidence of cognitive impairment sufficient to warrant guardianship. She noted that your medical evaluation contradicted the family's claims, and that your testimony demonstrated clear thinking and sound judgment. She was particularly critical of the investigative methods used to build the case against you. The victory felt surreal after weeks of uncertainty. I was still legally myself, still free to make my own decisions, still the owner of my own life. Frank, what happens now? Now you continue living exactly as you have been. Michael has no legal authority over your affairs, and this decision creates a strong precedent if he tries anything similar in the future. After I hung up, I sat in my quiet kitchen for a long time, absorbing the magnitude of what had just happened. I had successfully defended my right to exist as an independent adult against my own son's attempt to control me. The feeling was both triumphant and heartbreaking. Within hours, word of the decision had spread through town with the same speed that news of the petition had traveled weeks earlier. Evelyn called to celebrate, Sarah cried with relief over the phone from Oregon, and Lisa stopped by after work with a bottle of champagne neither of us would drink, but that somehow felt necessary to mark the occasion. Michael's reaction came in the form of silence. No phone call, no visit, no acknowledgement of the court's decision. It was as if he had simply erased me from his life the moment he lost his legal case against me. Jennifer called 3 days later, her voice small and apologetic. "Dorothy, I wanted you to know that I'm sorry about everything that happened. I should have trusted my own observations instead of letting Michael convince me you were declining. Jennifer, what's going to happen with your family now?" "I don't know. Michael is talking about appealing the decision, but his attorney told him it would be pointless. He's angry and humiliated, and he's taking it out on everyone around him." "What about Jake and Josh?" "They're confused and upset. They never understood why their father was doing this to you in the first place, and now they're questioning a lot of things about him." 6 months later, I received an unexpected letter in my mailbox. The return address showed an apartment complex in Minneapolis, and the handwriting was Michael's. Inside was a single sheet of paper with just a few sentences. "Mom, I've had time to think about what happened, and I realize I was wrong. I convinced myself I was protecting you, but I was really trying to control you. I'm sorry for the pain I caused, and I understand if you can't forgive me. I've moved back to Minneapolis and started therapy to figure out why I thought what I did was acceptable. Maybe someday we can talk again." I read the letter several times, feeling a complex mixture of emotions. It wasn't a full apology or a complete acknowledgement of the damage he had done, but it was recognition that his behavior had been wrong. Whether it represented genuine remorse or just another manipulation was impossible to know. I never answered the letter. Instead, I focused on the relationships that had sustained me through the ordeal. Sarah visited more frequently, and Lisa and I developed a closer bond built on mutual respect rather than worry. Jake and Josh came by regularly, having chosen to maintain their relationship with me despite the conflict with their father. A year after the court case, I did something that surprised everyone, including myself. I started dating Harold Gustafson's younger brother, William, who had moved back to South Dakota after his wife's death. We met at a community center dance and discovered we both appreciated the value of independence even within a relationship. William never tried to manage my affairs or question my decisions. He brought flowers to my kitchen table and shared stories about farming in the old days. When people asked if we were planning to marry, we laughed and said we were too old to worry about what other people expected. The experience with Michael had taught me something valuable about the difference between love and control, between care and manipulation. Real love supports autonomy even when it worries about outcomes. Real care respects the dignity of choice even when those choices seem risky. On quiet evenings, sitting on my front porch watching the sunset paint the prairie in shades of gold and amber, I sometimes thought about the irony of the situation. Michael had tried to prove I couldn't remember names anymore, so I had remembered to remove his name from my will. He had questioned my ability to make rational decisions, so I had made the most rational decision of my life by protecting myself from his control. The land around my house still stretched endlessly toward the horizon, and the wind still carried stories across the fields. But now those stories included my own tale of survival, of an old woman who refused to be diminished by someone else's need for power. I had defended my right to grow old with dignity, and I had won. That victory belonged to me alone, and no one could ever take it away. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.